Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're wrestling with, well, a pretty challenging idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I mean, just think about
Right.
that. Capitalism feels so permanent, right? So natural, almost like it's always been here. But, as a truly global system, it's actually less than 500 years old. So our mission today is to kind of unpack that huge transformation over those 5 centuries. We're going to look at how a simple system of exchange became, well, the system for everything,
Mm.
how it started consuming land, labor, time, even life itself. And we'll do this by focusing on one key commodity. Cotton. Yeah, cotton. You'll see how making cloth basically changed what it means to be human. We'll look at who built this system, who fought against it, and how its legacy still shapes our world right now. Our material for this deep dive comes from a really comprehensive historical overview, taking us through centuries of this global story. Okay, so let's try and get our heads around this. Can we actually imagine a world before market logic just took over everything? Because 500 years back, I mean, life was profoundly different for most people. They hardly ever used money. They grew their own food, made their clothes. Land was often shared, common land. The market wasn't some invisible force everywhere. It was like a physical place you went to on market day.
Exactly. It wasn't the organizing principle of life itself. And think about cotton back then, say around 1780. You had farmers in India, Gujarat maybe, growing cotton alongside their rice. They'd been perfecting textiles for thousands of years, stuff so fine they called it woven wind or morning dew. Marco Polo was amazed by it, said it could slip through a wedding ring.
Wow. Woven wind.
Yeah. And in West Africa, too, women interplanted cotton with food crops, weaving on backstrap looms. It was skilled, intimate work passed down through generations.
Then meanwhile in Europe?
Well, most people wore pretty rough stuff. Scratchy wool, stiff linen, cotton was exotic, expensive, Europe was mostly feudal, peasants lived on land owned by lords, but they had rights to the commons, shared forests for hunting, heaths for fuel, pastures for animals.
These commons sound really important.
Oh, absolutely vital. For survival, yes, but also for community life. And they offered a certain space for women's autonomy, which is interesting.
But this wasn't some kind of peaceful utopia, right?
Oh, no, definitely not. Life could be incredibly harsh, brutal even. But the key difference, and this is what our sources highlight, is why. Conflict and hardship existed, but they weren't driven by this relentless global pursuit of profit that came later. Resistance wasn't usually about wages either.
So what was it about?
Often about protecting those commons, those traditional rights. You had medieval movements like the Cathars, challenging hierarchy, and then there were big peasant revolts. Like in England, 1381. This priest, John Ball, asked this amazing question. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman.
Meaning who decided some people rule and others work.
Exactly. He was saying, hierarchy isn't natural, it's made up. They marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, demanding the commons back. For a moment, things really hung in the balance. But the point is, ownership and work just meant something totally different then. It was about community survival, not profit maximization. And dismantling that world, it took incredible violence.
Okay, so that's the world we're leaving behind. How did we get from that? From artisans and commons to a system that, like the sources say, consumed it all. It seems to start with something historians call war capitalism.
Right. Think about Vasco da Gama sailing around Africa in 1497. His ships weren't just for trade, they had cannons. That was new in the Indian Ocean, that level of force linked directly to commerce. And just 5 years before that, of course, Columbus and the Americas, these two voyages, they kind of kick-started it all.
Commerce married to violence, one historian calls it.
Yeah, that sums it up pretty well. And there were reasons why European rulers were looking outward so aggressively. Back home, peasants were actually gaining some power, getting better wages, shorter working days after the plagues. This was weakening the lords.
So the solution was?
Find new workers elsewhere and take land elsewhere. Simple as that, but devastating in practice.
And they created this kind of split world.
Exactly. Sort of law and order at home, pure violence abroad. The Portuguese led the way with gunpowder. Then you get the big trading companies, Dutch, British. These weren't just businesses. They were like corporations with armies, making treaties, fighting wars.
And financing it all.
American silver, huge amounts, especially from Potosi and Bolivia.
Yep.
That silver flowed back to Europe, paid for the cannons, paid for the ships, and crucially, it paid for Indian textiles. Beautiful fabrics that became, well, they became the currency for something much darker.
The slave trade.
Yeah, the triangle of horror, as it's sometimes called. The problem was, European diseases had wiped out huge numbers of indigenous people in the Americas, and European workers were too expensive or unwilling.
So they turned to Africa.
The Portuguese started in the 1450s, but it scaled up massively. Over the next few centuries, at least 12 million Africans were forced onto ships, taken across the Atlantic.
And the triangle worked how?
Okay, so European ships take goods, including those Indian textiles, to Africa to trade for enslaved people. Then, those people are transported under horrific conditions, the Middle Passage to the Americas, forced to grow sugar, tobacco, and later, huge amounts of cotton.
And the profits from that.
Flow back to Europe to fund more voyages, more guns, more capturing of people. It was a vicious cycle fueled by immense suffering.
And the companies involved knew exactly what they were doing.
Oh, absolutely. There's this chilling quote from the East India Company talking about needing textiles for the trade, on which the well-being of the British plantation so much depends. Just cold calculation.
So this wasn't just markets evolving naturally.
Not at all. Our sources really stress this. It was a deliberate, violent restructuring of the global economy, a counter-revolution in a way, against those rising peasant demands in Europe. Violence wasn't just a regrettable side effect of business. It was the foundation of the business. It changed everything.
And this violence wasn't just happening far away, was it? It was transforming communities back in Europe, too. Let's talk about England and the enclosure movement.
Right, starting really in the early 1500s, but accelerating later. Landlords started putting up hedges and fences around the common lands. Overnight, basically.
Why?
Sheep. Wool was becoming very profitable, much more so than having peasants using the land for subsistence. So, common land became private property. Thomas More wrote about it at the time, that bitter line about sheep becoming so greedy they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves.
So families just lost their access to pastures, woods, everything.
Yeah. Suddenly they couldn't graze their cow, couldn't gather firewood, couldn't hunt rabbits. A small wage, if they could even get one, wasn't enough to survive without the commons.
Whole villages just vanished.
Disappeared from the map. People were forced off the land, became rootless wanderers, vagabonds and masterless men they were called. Destitute.
Did people fight back?
Oh, definitely. There were riots, people tore down the new hedges. Kett's Rebellion in 1549 was huge. 16,000 rebels captured the city of Norwich. But they were crushed, brutally. By the 1700s, the process was largely complete. England had become a nation of property owners and wage laborers.
And then the state steps in to manage these displaced people.
Exactly. With the bloody laws that essentially criminalized poverty. If you were a vagabond, you could be branded, whipped, enslaved, even hanged. And then came the workhouses, the houses of correction, places designed to force the poor into disciplined labor, often for just bread and water. The message was clear: work for a wage or else.
Now, our sources point out something really striking here, the specific impact this had on women.
Yes. Sylvia Federici calls it a social enclosure. Women had roles in the old village economy, dairying, gardening, brewing, even healing, that were visible, valued. Yeah. In the new wage economy, that work often became invisible, unpaid domestic labor. Women became much more dependent on a male wage earner.
And this happens around the same time as the witch hunts.
Precisely. The Great Witch Hunt starts intensifying around 1580. And the sources argue this wasn't some leftover medieval superstition. It was a modern terror, a calculated assault on women's knowledge and autonomy.
Modern terror? How so?
Well, it was systematic. You had manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, basically a guidebook for persecuting women. Midwives were a particular target.
Why midwives?
Because they possessed traditional knowledge about the body, about fertility, contraception, abortion, knowledge the emerging state wanted to control. Remember, this was a time of plagues, wars, famine. Labor was scarce. The state needed women's bodies to produce more workers. Federici's phrase is stark. The womb became public territory.
So the charges against accused witches often related to?
Reproduction, yes. Hindering conception, causing miscarriages, killing infants. It was also about destroying women's role as healers, replacing them with university-trained male physicians. And it reflected a deep fear of female independence. The outspoken woman, the scold, the widow living alone. Women gathering together, those gatherings were twisted into demonic Sabbath fantasies, which often mirrored, interestingly, peasant revolts and gatherings.
So these enclosures, witch hunts, they're connected.
Deeply connected, according to this analysis. They work together to create what some call modern patriarchy, a system where women's crucial labor, both producing goods and producing people, was brought under control, often unpaid. Their subordination wasn't just social, it became economically essential.
Okay, so the land in England is enclosed, the workforce is disciplined, often through fear and violence. The stage is set for the machines.
It's exactly the Industrial Revolution. But it wasn't just about inventions like the spinning jenny or the water frame in Manchester around, say, 1790. Those machines were incredibly productive, yes, but they created a huge new problem. They needed vast amounts of raw cotton. Where was it going to come from?
The American South.
Right. The newly formed United States had land, huge tracts of it, taken from Native American nations like the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw. And then in 1793, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. Suddenly, the short staple cotton that grew well there became massively profitable.
And production just exploded.
Exploded from about 1.5 million pounds in 1790 to 167 million pounds just 30 years later. Staggering.
But that needed labor on an unimaginable scale.
Which led to the internal slave trade within the U.S. About 1 million enslaved people were forcibly moved from older states like Virginia and Maryland down to the new cotton plantations in the Deep South. A brutal second Middle Passage.
And these plantations, they weren't primitive operations.
No, not at all. That's a key point. They were highly organized, efficient, almost like factories in the field. Work was measured, days were tightly regulated, productivity tracked relentlessly. There's that chilling quote from an enslaved man, John Brown, saying when cotton prices went up in Liverpool, the whip came down harder on their backs.
And this whole brutal system was financed
by major European banks, like Baring Brothers in London. They provided the credit and the collateral for those loans. Often it was the enslaved people themselves.
Unbelievable.
And after the international slave trade was officially banned in 1808, planters relied on forced reproduction, what they called natural increase, forcing enslaved women to bear children, turning, as the sources say, wombs into sites of capital accumulation.
So by the mid-19th century.
By 1850, enslaved people in America were producing something like 2/3 of the entire world's cotton supply. The British Industrial Revolution, the wealth of Manchester, was utterly dependent on it, built on stolen land and stolen labor.
And this flood of cheap, machine-made British cotton had consequences elsewhere.
Devastating consequences. It led to what's called the deindustrialization of the Global South. For centuries, India had exported fine textiles to Britain. Now, that flow reversed completely.
British cloth undercut Indian weavers.
Totally. Indian cloth exports to Britain crashed down 75% in just 10 years at the start of the 1800s. Cheap British factory cloth flooded the Indian market, selling for less than the cost of local raw cotton.
So entire communities of skilled artisans
were ruined, faced starvation. And the British colonial government actively helped this along, imposing tariffs on Indian cloth, copying designs, basically trying to turn India from a textile producer into just a supplier of raw cotton for British mills. And you see similar patterns happening in China, Mexico, Egypt, Peru. This is how the modern Global South was partly created as dependent suppliers of raw materials. It locked in inequalities that persist today.
Then comes the American Civil War in 1861, a massive shock to the system.
Huge, because the entire global textile industry, centered in Britain, ran on cotton picked by 4 million enslaved Americans. Senator Hammond wasn't really exaggerating when he said cotton is king.
So the Union blockade of southern ports
calls an immediate cotton famine in Europe. Mills in Manchester shut down. Maybe a quarter of the population in Lancashire faced unemployment and starvation.
So they scrambled to find cotton anywhere else.
Desperately, Britain turned to India again, forcing peasants to grow cotton instead of food. India's share of the British cotton market leaped from 16% to 75%. Similar things happened in Egypt, using forced peasant labor, the corvée, and in Brazil. The war basically globalized the search for cheap, coerced cotton labor.
Meanwhile, in the U.S. itself,
enslaved people took the opportunity to free themselves, many joining the Union Army. But even after the war, freedom was limited.
How?
Through new systems of control. Black codes, restricting movement and work, debt peonage, trapping people in endless debt cycles, sharecropping, which often amounted to the same thing, plus vagrancy laws, convict leasing, and horrific violence like lynching. Thousands were murdered between the 1880s and 1930s. It wasn't chattel slavery, but it was still profound coercion.
It seems like the system just adapted.
That's exactly what the sources argue. It's cyclical. When one form of exploitation becomes impossible, like chattel slavery, the system invents new ones. Debt, contracts, legal tricks. They replaced the auction block and the whip, but the misery continued. Cotton's rule endured.
So this long, often brutal history brings us closer to the present day. The empire of cotton didn't just vanish after the Civil War, did it?
No, it morphed again. By the late 19th, early 20th century, wages were rising for workers in Britain and the U.S., so factory owners started looking for cheaper labor elsewhere. The return of the global south, you could call it.
Where did they look first?
Japan was a major player. Between about 1880 and 1930, they built up a massive textile industry, 7 million spindles.
And the workforce.
Overwhelmingly young women, recruited from poor farming villages. Terrible conditions, 12-hour shifts, sometimes 120 hours a week. Wages were often sent straight to their fathers. One historian calls it exploitation on a scale that Europe hadn't seen in decades.
And other places followed.
India, particularly around Ahmedabad, started building its own modern mills. Brazil, too, again, relying on labor pools made cheap by the legacies of colonialism or slavery.
Then you have the big disruptions of the 20th century.
Right. World War I cut off European shipping, which actually boosted textile production in Asia, China, India, Japan really took off. That marked the beginning of the end for British dominance. Then the Great Depression hit the old industrial centers in Lancashire and New England really hard. Mills closed down.
And nationalism plays a role, too.
Definitely. Think of Gandhi and the spinning wheel in India, the charkha. It became a powerful symbol of resisting British economic control. The Swadeshi movement, boycotting foreign goods. Political freedom and economic self-sufficiency were linked.
So by the mid-20th century, the center of gravity has shifted.
Completely. By 1950, Asia was producing more textiles than Europe and North America combined.
And after World War II, with decolonization,
Many newly independent nations, India, Egypt, China under Mao, saw industrialization, especially textiles, as key to national strength. They launched 5-year plans, nationalized industries.
but what did that mean for the workers?
Often, just a new boss. Independent trade unions were frequently suppressed, strikes banned. The sources suggest that the tools of colonial labor control were sometimes used even more intensely by the new national governments, all in the name of development.
Which brings us to globalization.
Yes. The latest phase. For the 1960s onwards, the old centers continued to decline. The Liverpool Cotton Exchange, once the heart of the global trade, finally closed its auction floor. The last big mill in Fall River, Massachusetts, shut down.
But production didn't stop, it just moved.
Exactly. And it changed how it was organized. Big Western companies like Walmart, Nike, Gap figured out they didn't need to own the factories anymore.
They could just control the supply chain.
Precisely. They could place orders with factories in Bangladesh, Vietnam, Honduras, wherever labor was cheapest at that moment. Dictate prices, deadlines, everything. Capital became incredibly mobile, like water, as one writer put it, flowing instantly toward the lowest point.
Leading to a race to the bottom.
In terms of wages, working hours, safety standards, absolutely. The workforce in these garment factories today is, again, overwhelmingly young women, often migrants from rural areas, working incredibly long hours for poverty wages.
And we saw the horrific potential consequences with Rana Plaza.
Yes, Bangladesh, 2013. Over 1,100 workers killed when an 8-story factory building collapsed. They were making clothes for major Western brands. The building had visible cracks. Workers had been afraid to go in but were forced.
The brand
Claimed they didn't know the conditions, distanced themselves. It highlighted this system. Global brands with huge power but little direct responsibility. They can just threaten to move production if local governments try to enforce safety rules or raise wages. And state power still plays a role, like U.S. cotton subsidies that undercut farmers in West Africa, keeping them dependent. It's a complex, often hidden system.
So the empire of cotton is still with us.
Absolutely. The methods are different, maybe fewer whips, more complex contracts and supply chains, but the fundamental dynamic. Making clothes cheaply often still relies on the exploitation and suffering of vulnerable people, mostly in the global south. The link between wealth and misery persists. Hashtag outro.
So where does this leave us today? We've covered, 500 years? An incredible journey through the rise of this global system, all seen through the lens of cotton. And it's generated unbelievable wealth, unbelievable productivity. Think about this. In the 1950s, it took a Chinese farming family maybe 60 days of hard labor just to get basic clothing. Today, someone in a wealthy country might spend the equivalent of, say, 8 days' wages for a wardrobe that honestly would have amazed royalty a century ago. The system does produce abundance on a scale never seen before.
But there's that inescapable paradox, isn't there? As one historian puts it, civilization and barbarity are linked at the hip. That abundance seems to constantly depend on creating poverty and hardship somewhere else in the system.
It's a heavy thought.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's also important, I think, not to just focus on the system's power, because running alongside this whole history, there's also been constant resistance, right from the English peasants tearing down those first enclosures,
To enslaved people risking everything to resist, burning cotton fields.
to factory workers striking in Lawrence, Massachusetts, or Lowell.
To garment workers walking out of unsafe factories in Bangladesh today.
Exactly. And these struggles, they're often about more than just wages, aren't they? Sylvia Federici's idea comes back here. It's a fight to reclaim the commons.
Not just land, but maybe reclaiming time, reclaiming dignity, reclaiming solidarity and mutual support, all the human connections that this system tries to turn into commodities. The future isn't predetermined. These struggles continue.
So the empire of cotton has shaped our world for 5 centuries. Empires rise, but they also fall. Nothing lasts forever. The question maybe isn't if the system will end, but what might come next. And here's something to really ponder. Could whatever replaces it finally deliver on the promise that seems to have fueled all that resistance across centuries? You know, a world where maybe everyone does have enough, where work supports life instead of consuming it, and where the things we all need, the real commons, belong to everyone? What would that world look like?